sulcus, but I pulled this model off the internet just because it's really nice to see the color changes really, and it's helpful to use the color changes to also point out some of the structures above. So we'll start with the frontal lobe, that's marked here in red. So notice the frontal lobe actually takes up a decent amount of space, right? So even though these lobes are going to follow the same pattern and be in approximately the same positions that we saw when we talked about the skull, it might be a little different than you remembered it, okay? So here we have the frontal lobe, the blue is the parietal, purple is occipital, green is temporal, okay? Those are the four that you need to know. Alright, so now that we have our landmarks in place, let's talk about the rest of these starting from the top. So first let's talk about what a gyrus and a sulcus are. I already mentioned when we were talking about the spinal cord that a sulcus is a crevice, right, or a gap. So in the brain you can see that it's basically made up of like wormy portions that are sticking out and crevices that are pushed in, okay? The wormy structures sticking out are the gyrus, the crevices are the sulcus. Now specifically, let's see, there's two sulcus and two fissures that have special names, and two gyrus that have special names that we'll be covering, okay? So we'll start with the longitudinal fissure, and that will actually go here. So the brain's made up of two hemispheres. The longitudinal fissure splits the two hemispheres, so it's the one that runs longitudinally, right down the middle. Alright, next we'll talk about the sulcuses. So we have the lateral sulcus and the central sulcus. The lateral sulcus is right here, and it splits the temporal region from the frontal and a little bit on the parietal. Now next we have the central sulcus. The central sulcus splits the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. It's right here. And I'm going to show you on the other view too, just because this is really an important one. If you start here at the top of the hemisphere, which I recommend, for the central sulcus, oh, why is that doing that? You can go all the way down. So you know it's the central sulcus because it's the one that you can actually like start here at the top and follow all the way down, and then you basically get this U-shaped gyrus that goes all the way around it. Okay? That's how you find the central sulcus. And again, it's not going to be like central to the top of the brain, as we kind of saw here. You'd think central in the brain would be just about here, but think about it being central to the entire cap, from the occipital to the frontal. Alright? Not just the top portion as in like the top of your head portion. Alright, then we have the transverse fissure. The transverse fissure separates the cerebrum, which is all of this with the gyrus and sulcus, from the cerebellum, which is this little guy that I pointed out. So the line right there near the occipital and temporal lobes, that would be the transverse fissure. Okay, and you'd be able to see that on the posterior side and on the lateral sides of the brain. Alright, so now let's talk about these special gyrus. So we have our central sulcus right here, and the precentral and postcentral gyrus are just the gyrus just in front of the central sulcus and the gyrus just behind the central sulcus. So this would be the precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus. If we flip over to our non-colored model, here's our central sulcus. This one's in front, so this is the anterior side of the brain. So here we have our precentral sulcus, our gyrus, and our postcentral gyrus. You can see that they run basically from the split in the middle of the hemisphere, that transverse fissure, or excuse me, the longitudinal fissure, all the way down to the, these names, the lateral sulcus. So it goes from one sulcus to this fissure, all the way. All right, any questions about this section of information on a brain model?